So Street Fighter Alpha means a lot to me. Just in general, Street Fighter Alpha 2, I think before Third Strike, was one of my favorite Capcom fighting games, period. If not, probably one of, I think, the best Street Fighter games, and I think a lot of people have very similar sentiments when it comes to the Alpha series. It's an interesting one because every game is so different from one another. We have to go back to the start, and I'm thinking a couple days ago, we went through Street Fighter Alpha 1. This game is fascinating as hell because it's directly inspired from the Street Fighter movie. The Street Fighter 2 animated movie came out in like the early 90s, around the same time as Super Turbo, because it's clearly inspired by Super Turbo. It has that same exact roster of Super Street Fighter 2. So much of that movie would go on to shape future Street Fighter games that it's insane. Future Street Fighter games from this point forward take so many elements that happen from the movie. Sagat and Ryu fighting in like a field, between rivalries of some characters. Like, many things are carried over because Capcom loves the result of the movie. They're huge fans of it, and rightfully so. Street Fighter 2 the animated movie is a absolute quintessential 90s era anime. It's perfect. I still love that film. I think it's one of the best video game movies ever made, but it has a huge impact because it's a direct influence on Capcom in the 90s when it goes with their future titles. That really applies to the Alpha series. So in Street Fighter Alpha 1, I'm pretty sure the art style of Alpha 1 wasn't inspired by the movie, just other elements were, but the direction this game took was interesting. I remember the first time I saw a Street Fighter Alpha 1 machine, and I was blown away by the visuals, not specifically in a good way. I kind of remember similar sentiments with other people that weren't anime familiar, because this was a period, this is like 1994, 1995, when anime isn't mainstream in any way at all. And I thought it looked like a cartoon, and I thought it looked silly. I was like, wow, why did Street Fighter suddenly turn into a cartoon? This looks so different than what Street Fighter 2 looked like. It makes no sense. Practically, like, Street Fighter 2's characters almost look realistic, quote unquote, in comparison to what Alpha was setting up, which was a very stylized, very cel-shaded look to its roster and characters. So I think Alpha 1 doesn't exactly grab an audience immediately, but as soon as you play it, you understand it, right? It actually looks way better overall between animation and character stylings and visuals and all this stuff. Alpha 1 sets a distinct precedent for how Street Fighter would kind of look from this point forward, because really, Street Fighter from this point forward is sort of like this. It never goes back to the heavily realistic visual style until like Street Fighter 6. It's really crazy. Even Street Fighter 3 extends these visuals quite a bit, where it's like, oh yeah, we're gonna go to a more like adult approach where all the characters are younger, we're going back in time type of stuff. That was the whole point of the Alpha series. We're going to bring characters before to where they were in Street Fighter 2. So you get teenage Ken and Ryu. Characters are essentially given their motivations from this point, which was an interesting take, right? I truly don't understand like why they chose to do that, simply because they did not want to age the characters up, but soft rebooting and going back to the basics of the Street Fighter Alphas is fascinating. Talking about gameplay, Alpha 1 is weird because it shares a lot of similarities with another Capcom fighting game that comes out around a very similar time frame, and it's Darkstalkers. Darkstalkers features these heavy chain combos. Alpha 1 also features heavy chain combos, and both games are respectively broken as shit. This was the period where Capcom was trying some shit with their fighting games. Well, now they have two fighting games instead of one, because Street Fighter 2 is no longer the only fighting game. They now have an Alpha series and a Darkstalkers series, so they're expanding a bit, but also sharing some similar elements. I feel like Alpha 1's a fun game. Alpha 1 is an enjoyable game. There is some goofy things about it. It doesn't feel as crisp and precise as the future games, but seeing what it does and how it sets up for stuff, the Alpha counter is a really cool idea. Giving you multiple meters of super was something that wasn't an ST, and a roster of characters that harkens back to Street Fighter 1. Characters like Birdie and like Gen and several of these roster members are going back to the SF1 roster, which is really interesting. Allowing people to even block in the air. Characters with unique mobility like the Shotos can roll sometimes. Like Ken gets a roll in this game. It's all very interesting. And then bringing Final Fight mainstays to the forefront and sort of merging Final Fight and Street Fighter together was a good idea, because you get like, you know, Sodom, and you get Guy, and later on Cody. The other thing about Alpha 1 that's really fun is a huge variety of secret roster members. And we accidentally got Bison at the start. I saw Bison. I just saw Akuma as well. They're in there. What the You can see them rotating around the random character select. Dan makes his appearance. He's kind of like a Steven Seagal ripoff, but more so a joke on SNK than anything. But the fun part is that all these characters are actually selectable. Akuma, Bison, and Dan are technically selectable in the arcade version of the game, much less also the console versions. We finally get to see Akuma in a different light. He's nuts. Like, he's truly broken in this game. One of the hardest boss fights in Capcom history, I think. We didn't even get a chance to beat him. I was running out of time. But he's also ridiculously broken. This is the first time the game would finally use a Raging Demon outside of a cutscene. Because back in Super Turbo, the Raging Demon was a cutscene. Not anymore. You can actually do a Raging Demon to a person. So it's neat. Like, once again, all the bones for future Capcom stuff are being set up, as well as like secret characters and roster members that would make mainstays. I like Alpha 1. I don't love it because clearly some of the backgrounds are kind of uninspired. It's still figuring out what it wants to be. And I think the full realization of the Street Fighter 2 animated movie doesn't come until Street Fighter Alpha 2. Alpha 2, one of my personal favorite Street Fighters. I've never actually been good at it, but I just love things about it, right? You know when you just like love a game, even though I'm not good at it at all? Between the characters, the visuals, the artwork, the music, the presentation, Alpha 2 just nails it, man. I personally feel with its custom combos and what it eventually sets up, everything just feels much snappier. My God, dude. And then it also has one of the most iconic images in Street Fighter history, much less video game history. It's got the Alpha 2 Ryu versus Akuma artwork with Sakura in the background of them just like looming in and facing each other. This art is legendary, and it goes on to be referenced in media all over the place from this point forward. It's about as legendary as the Marvel vs. Capcom 1 art, with all the characters looking at each other. But Alpha 2 is cool because it brings in a lot more characters. It brings in Sakura for the first time. This ends up just being an absolute home run of a character. I remember Birdie from, SF Alpha 1 not being super popular, and Gen and stuff like that showing up later down the line. They were okay, but Sakura is just a 100% guaranteed smash hit of a character, and everyone loves her. Rolento comes back, another Final Fight reference. We get characters like Zangief making their popular return. The roster just feels good, and it feels right? It feels like everything is just appropriate in Street Fighter Alpha 2. It's funny because I still watch it competitively to this day, and it's still like I think one of the best examples of a footsie-based like fireball fighting game, which it is, with some cheap stuff, because this is the first time Capcom would utilize custom combos, and custom combos would ultimately make or break Capcom fighting games from this point forward. This game starts it, and they're really good, insanely busted in some ways. Every character can get absolutely massive damage for even a small amount of meter. But it is enjoyable, it is fun. Some characters are clearly better than others at this, but figuring out what custom combos are good, activating them is weird. It's like 2 punches and a kick or vice versa. But all this solution that you have to figure out to how do I chain all these attacks together and do crazy stuff, it was clearly an answer that people wanted to do big combos, right? There was an answer from the audience that we're seeing really cool combos that you can do, but they're too hard. How do we do easy big combos? When you activate custom combo mode, your character instantly runs forward. It's really bizarre. Like, the game auto pushes your ass forward because we need to give our players a way to combo all this crazy shit together. Well, your character will just ignore hit stun and just run their asses forward. It's very goofy. The reason they did that is because you can just mash on the arcade stick and get combos and get a big chain combo or some nutty thing that would result in a lot of hits, which is what people wanted. Combos were huge around this time frame of arcade fighting games. Like, this was the era of Killer Instinct. It was the era of like the Versus games were about to start. The combos were everywhere, dude. They had to do something because Street Fighter, needed big combos. Like I said, this would make or break the series from this point forward. It would turn into every single iteration that it's included in is busted, and it's the best shit ever. As soon as we introduce custom combos, it's over, bruh. It's just the best in the world, and you can't get away from it. I think it's obviously good. Alpha 2 is not a wonderfully balanced game. There is characters in this game that are way better than others. So much about it is incredibly cool. A funny note, later versions down the line would fix a lot of stuff. Alpha counters are crazy good at the beginning of Alpha 2, but then they would update the game and they would patch out a lot of the damage that those alpha counters would have and some damage of custom combos. Custom combos go to activating with a heavy punch and heavy kick, so they're a lot easier to do. It makes a lot more sense. And then eventually the game gets this gold update that we would see in later Street Fighter collections. Later adds Cammy as a playable character to the game. Dope! Everybody loves Cammy. It was weird that she wasn't in the Street Fighter Alpha games in general. However, she is quite literally a direct sprite rip of another Capcom fighting game that came out around the same time frame, which is X-Men vs. Street Fighter. X-Men vs. Street Fighter was the first game, I believe, to incorporate Cammy as a playable character that wasn't in Street Fighter 2, and they later just used that sprite, that Killer Bee Cammy sprite, in Alpha. It's funny, obviously, you know, the Street Fighter Alphas contributed to the majority of sprites that you would see in the X-Men vs. Street Fighter games and, you know, stuff like that going forward. But Cammy was the opposite. She was actually a new sprite and then got stuck into Alpha 2 Gold. There's really another cool story of Alpha 2. A very late port shows up on the SNES of Street Fighter Alpha 2. It's like a miracle game. The SNES actually able to pump out the visuals of Street Fighter Alpha 2. We've played it several times on the channel and have checked out different versions of it. And weirdly enough, it has some glaring issues. It has some crazy loading at the start.
Okay, ready? Here we do. Oh my God!
A lot of that is because the game was sort of rushed in the final moments of it being shipped. They quite literally screwed up with the code and how the game loads assets. I believe at one point we got into the SNES version and changed the ROM and made the adjustment that somebody found that no, Alpha 2 on SNES runs good. It's just somebody screwed up before the game came out. They changed like a couple of values in like the hex or something like that, and no kidding, the loading issue is gone. So if you wanted to, if you have like a cart loader on your Super Nintendo, you can actually run Street Fighter Alpha 2 on an SNES without the funky loading. That's sort of a miracle port that comes way down the line in the Super Nintendo's lifespan. And I remember really not liking that version of the game because I had a Saturn. You know, funny enough, it really is a miracle that they were able to even get that thing working on a system that had that little capability. What I love about every single version of these games, and I haven't mentioned yet, is that Street Fighter Alpha 1, 2, and 3 all introduce some of the most fun that you would actually have in a fighting game, and it's called Dramatic Battle. Street Fighter Alpha 1 Dramatic Battle is a secret selectable mode where you can get, even in the arcade, a second player to join in and fight against Bison. Literally is a recreation of Street Fighter the animated movie, of Ryu and Ken fighting Bison in the absolute epic climax of the film. Cool! You get to play that, and then home versions, you get to play it on the menu mode. You don't have to do this crazy selection. Amazing! Street Fighter Alpha 2 is the exact same way, where when Alpha 2 makes its way home, Dramatic Battle is available to select. You get to select Dramatic Battle. You get to select these really fun modes where you and a friend can team up and fight against Bison or a collection of bosses on the way to fighting a big crazy Bison. It's so cool, and as we said before, it's in Ultra Street Fighter 2. They eventually added it later, even in Ultra SF2, but Alpha's where it came from, and technically it's inspired from the movie. So I love Alpha 2, and I think Alpha 2 goes down as one of the best Street Fighter games ever.